This is our first LinkedIn Live, and we've selected the topic, which is very close to our heart. And this is something we are very busy with these days, which is the challenges of Western countries, Western culture working with India and vice versa. So we're going to be taking some questions. If you have any questions, comments, please add them to your LinkedIn comment section. We get them and we see them and we will take care of them. But me and Keith will have a discussion because both of us are very busy on this topic, and hopefully we'll add some personal stories, some insights, and a few questions that I'll ask from Keith. It should be good 30 minutes. Just a quick introduction. If you don't know me, my name is Navkaran Singh. So I'm based out of the UK. I'm one of the senior consultants in global business culture. And as I mentioned, one of my personal favorite topic and the sessions I'm really busy with is West and India working together. And I've joined here with our CEO of Global Business Culture, who's also based out of the UK, Keith Warbuton. Keith, you want to introduce quickly?
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so as I've said, I'm Keith Warbuton. I'm CEO of Global Business Culture. We're going to be talking today, as Nav said, about the issue of Western businesses who are operating with and working with colleagues in Indian operations, whether that be offshore operations, manufacturing operations, whatever it might be. And I first started working on this West to India corridor, on the cultural aspects of that, actually in 1996. So I've been working on these projects for almost 30 years now, and I've lost count of the number of projects that I have actually worked on, but it's certainly in excess of 60, 70, and those projects have ranged from the transition of a few positions from, let's say, America into India, through to the development of an operation in India with 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 employees over there. And over that period, I have noticed a number of commonalities in terms of the challenges that my clients have faced with that issue of working with India. And what we want to do today is just to talk about a few of those issues. And we've only got 30 minutes. We're not going to spend more than 30 minutes on this. And therefore, the things we talk about today will not be an exhaustive list. But there's some of the things that we think might be of interest to people. And I think it's quite important to say at this point that today what we're going to be talking about is the challenges that people in the West very often feel they face when they're working with colleagues in India. But it's also worth bearing in mind that your colleagues in India will have lots of challenges working with people in the West. There's always the flip side of that coin. And we will be doing another webinar in the not too distant future on that, of problems that India has facing with the West. But today we're going to focus very much on the West to India corridor. So I hope you enjoy it.
Great. We have a few obviously questions that we will ask, and like I mentioned, if any of our viewers have any questions or comments you want to add, I think you add them as a comment in LinkedIn Live and it comes through to us, and we will take them as they come. So Keith, let me jump straight into the main crux of the issue today, which is how do cultural differences play a role when a lot of the teams are working out or based out of the Western countries, work with India-based countries? What's your experience? Can you share some ideas with us?
Well, the first thing to say, I think, would be that obviously cultural issues don't only impact between, let's say, the USA and India. There are always cultural issues. It could be the UK working with America, or it could be France working with Germany. There are always cultural issues there. And those cultural issues, depending on which countries are working together, vary, obviously. But I think there are some significant cultural differences between the way in which business is generally done in the West and the way in which business is generally done in India. And when we talk about generally done, we're talking about most of the people most of the time. We're not talking about everybody all the time. That would be far too generalistic. But there's no doubt in my mind that one of the biggest barriers to making the West to India interface work as effectively as possible is around that cultural interface. The fact that people in the States, because of their background and their history and their working experience, they look at business through a certain set of cultural spectacles, and what good looks like in their eyes across the whole range of different activities, whether that be how meetings are run or how teams operate together. Through their cultural spectacles, they have certain expectations because they're American. But of course, Indians are also wearing their own pair of cultural spectacles, and they also have a set of expectations. But the challenge in this cultural piece is that American expectations and Indian expectations are quite often significantly different. And there's a gap between those two things. And it's the gap between the US expectations or the UK expectations and the Indian expectations around what good looks like. That's where these challenges are. And it's that gap that you have to bridge. And it's that gap that we spend a lot of our time helping our clients to bridge. And you would obviously expect me to say this because I run a business which is called Global Business Culture. So I'm obviously going to say that the cultural piece is very important. But I don't say it's important because I want to make the world a nicer place. I want everybody to love each other. I say to my clients it's important because if you don't get these cultural issues right, the cost arbitrage that you thought you were going to get from moving work to India, or the scaling arbitrage that you thought you were going to get from moving some operation to India, will not be realized, and you'll be frustrated. Quality, if you don't sort this out, might take a hit. And you cannot afford to not address this issue if you want your Indian operations to work effectively. But unfortunately, in our experience, lots of clients do ignore this issue. And we know that they ignore this issue because, I don't know the exact numbers, but let's say 25% of our clients will come to us and say, we're looking at opening an operation in India next year. What do we need to know in advance so we can factor it into our planning? That's 25%. But 75% of our clients come to us and say, we opened an operation in India 2 years ago, and it's been really challenging, and we're not getting the results that we hoped we'd get. What's gone wrong? And it's much more difficult to solve the problems when things have gone wrong than it is to try and get it right from the beginning. So it is an absolutely critical element that you have to factor in when you're going to be working into India.
Great. Yeah. Can you give us some examples? So so we understand the things that are done differently in these parts of the world. Are there any, especially when it comes to business, what sort of things that have you seen going wrong or done differently in this where people don't agree with each other?
So one of the most common, I think, where you see the challenges is in the frustrations that people verbalize to you. So very often, for example, we'll get a leader in the USA with a team in India, or a leader in the UK with a team in India, and their comment to me is, they're just not meeting my expectations. And I say, oh, that's interesting. So have you ever actually explained to them what your expectations are of them as team members in your team? Have you ever actually explained to them what is your leadership style, what they can expect from you, and what your expectations are in terms of the way that they operate to you and that they operate with other team members? And the answer to that question is, well, no, I've never really talked to them about that. So why have you never talked to them about that? Well, because I just assumed that they would know what my expectations are, because there's an assumption that what my expectations are as an American leader will be understood, and that Indians will have the same expectations, and they don't. And you get that gap between the two. So, for example, an American leader will very often say, they seem to expect me to tell them exactly what to do in very great detail. and I don't want to do that. I just want to give them an objective and for them to go off and meet that objective. And then when you talk to their Indian team, the Indian team will say, I never really know what my leader wants me to do because he never gives me any direct instructions. And so there's a big gap between those two. And that's where things just don't happen. That's where you will get project delays and missed deadlines and things. And it's just those simple things that are not addressed. And the question I always ask myself is, why are they not addressed? And I think there's two reasons why they're not addressed. And the first one is related to that phrase that I love, which is fish cannot see the water in which they swim. So an American manager doesn't really think about this stuff. He just operates as he operates. The Indian team colleague doesn't really think about these things. They just operate as they are. And they don't understand their own cultural approach, let alone the approach of the other side. And so it's difficult to communicate. And then even if this is raised as an issue, I think people find it very difficult to talk about cultural differences. It's something which is a little bit embarrassing, or we fear we're going to offend people. And I think, as you always say, Nav, one of the things that we try to do in the workshops we do with our clients and the consultancy work we do with our clients is to give them a language that they can use, a comfortable, comforting language they can use to be able to discuss these things without it being challenging or a problem. So there are many areas, and then well, as you know, let me ask you the question now. What is the most common reason that our clients come to us to ask us to do some work with them? What's the biggest problem that they identify?
I think they obviously, like you said, they come in different flavors, but I think at the end of the day, a lot of the time we hear is that there's a communication issue.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
So they don't understand, or there's not enough participation from certain people, or if there was an issue, why wasn't it talked about, or why there's not enough guidance from my teams in the West and so on. And I think normally it's labeled under communication problem.
And so to take one of those examples that you just gave there, that a common complaint you get in the West is that our Indian team members, we've got a communication problem with our Indian team members because they never speak in meetings. So there's a communication problem. And then you say to the people who say that to you, you say, okay, so those people who don't speak in meetings, if you have a one-to-one conversation with them, can they communicate well? They said, yeah, their English is really good. We don't have any problems. And I said, well, you don't have a communication problem, do you? That's not a communication problem because they can communicate. What's the reason behind that? Why are Indians not as participative in meetings as you might expect them to be if they're in the USA? And that's to do with the way in which they interface with their leaders in India. It's to do with concepts of hierarchy and things like that. But it's not a communication issue. And I think the problem is, and this is something that we spend a lot of time trying to convince our clients, is that they're convinced that the problem they have is communication. And that's kind of part of the problem. But the problems are much deeper and they're much more multifaceted than purely communication. And if all you do is try and address the communication piece, you're not going to make any progress whatsoever. I guarantee everybody that. That should be a subset. And I would say it's not even at the top of, anywhere near the top of the list you need to. But with these cultural issues, as you know, people identify with the surface level. And you've got to dig a lot deeper than that.
So you could say, Keith, the communication is just one of the manifestations that we see how culture plays a role in business, but it's understanding the why behind it, that why there's a different communication style in India compared to a different communication style in the US, in meetings versus one-on-one, giving direct feedback versus indirect feedback. Are we talking about issues or is it positive feedback? All of that, part of that stems from how culture, or what culture expects the norms to be in that part of the world versus the West. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And when you talk about things like direct and indirect communication, and that is a big difference in communication styles between America for example, and India. But interestingly, it's a much less of an issue between the UK and India, because the UK is also an indirect culture, whereas America is a direct culture. So these things are quite complicated. But the things that people have to accept is there is no wrong and right here. There's not a good and a bad. And we've worked with clients, for example, in the USA, who one of their corporate values is that people should communicate to each other using radical candor. That's their corporate value. To be a good, valued employee, you should operate with radical candor. But when you say that to people in India, you've got to use radical candor with everybody. But basically, you're just telling people in India to be rude to everybody that they operate with. And it doesn't matter if that's your corporate value. It doesn't matter if you believe in that passionately. They're never going to do that. They can't do it. It's almost physically impossible for them to do that. In the same way that as a Brit, I find it incredibly difficult to be very direct and use radical candor to people. And so one of the things I think that companies in the States or the UK, they have to really look at is how can they transpose that corporate culture into India? Do their values fit? Can you just pick and pack all of those things? And if you can't, what do you need to adapt? Because they can have really serious consequences. So one of the things you can say about Indian business culture, and I know a lot of Indians will kind of challenge you these days on this, but India is a massively hierarchical business culture, and Indians will say, oh, that's historic, we used to be, and maybe it is slightly less hierarchical now than it was 10 or 15 years ago, but in comparison with the UK or the USA, it is massively hierarchically oriented. And so if you have a very flat matrixed organization in the USA or the UK with maybe 4 management grades, and you replicate that in India into a massively hierarchical culture where people are tremendously aspirational and want promotion, and where job titles and improvements in job titles are tremendously societally important, how's that going to work? If people can't get promotion because there's no job title above where they are, and you say you're going to be in that same job title for the next 7 years, well, they're going to leave. They're going to leave. And what is one of the biggest challenges that a lot of our clients face in India have?
Yeah, and I mean, that was going to be obviously my next question is that a lot of the clients we work with, they will also find the level of attrition that we see in India, I think across all industries. So some industries is more than others, but I think on average, attrition levels in India are higher than most of the Western countries in most of the sectors. So what's your opinion around that? Do you think culture plays a role? Do you think the impact of working in an international team has anything to do with it?
I think so. And you know, before I answer that, of course, we're not saying that there's no attrition in the West, in the UK, in Germany, in the States. Of course, there's attrition, but attrition levels in India are notoriously high. They rise and fall a little bit, usually in following economic cycles. Obviously, if there's if the market is tighter, people move job less. But India's a very buoyant market from an employment perspective, and at a basic level, that's one of the reasons why people move, because they can, because there's lots of job opportunities there. But I think culture does impact on that. So in what ways might culture impact on that? Well, the first thing I've said is, you know, if there's nowhere to go, if there's no promotion prospects, if I'm not going to get a better job title, well, I'll move to another company. So if you, and this is, I can't tell my clients what their corporate strategy on this should be, but they need to be aware of this when they make their decision. if you decide, no, we have a global approach that says we only have 4 management grades and we cannot make an exception for India because that would be unfair to the rest of the global operations, that's fine by me. But you have to take that decision in the knowledge that it will probably have a negative impact on your attrition rates. So that can be one.
Yeah, I think I've worked with clients where there were exceptions in India where they will have different levels between those main levels to cater for this need in India that you need to provide more promotions more often than you would do in the West. That's just an exception. I think whether they did that with the knowledge or whether they actually went that way because nothing else was working, I'm not sure. But I think that's one of the key things to keep in mind.
Yeah, and our advice would always be that you should do that if you're worried about attrition. But we equally have worked with some clients who said it's just not possible given our corporate approach in other countries. So that's one reason why attrition is high. But I think there are other reasons why attrition is high. For example, one of the biggest cultural differences you find in approach to work would be that some cultures are more business focused and some cultures are more relationship focused. And India is very much on the relationship side there. And Indians in the working environment, they want to work in an environment where they have strong, close relationships with their colleagues. It's almost like a family environment, and their leader is part of the family as well. And if you have a very transactional relationship coming from the USA or the UK, where people just don't feel as if they belong to the organization, don't feel valued and loved, if you like, then they might vote with their feet and say, well, I'll go somewhere else where I've got that more familial relationship with me. But Western companies don't, on the whole, really think very much about those issues. Are there other issues that you can think of where attrition is?
No, I was just thinking that while you were talking about the relationship piece, I think I also put in one of my LinkedIn posts a couple of weeks ago, is that I was doing a session with the French team who works with India. And one of the French participants said, I got really uncomfortable. And it was very personal that one of my colleagues in India, who I've only been working with for a few months, invited me to his wedding.
Right.
And he was asking, do you think I should go? Well, how should I handle it? And I think I was quite surprised that he was surprised that he got invited to the wedding, because that is something that you would do in India, that for your wedding, you invite all your colleagues. And this is also an Indian participant kind of trying to build a relationship by this gesture of inviting you to something so personal. But from a French perspective, he almost kind of felt that this was unprofessional. And I think that's where it boils down to understand why my colleagues in India do something which I find unprofessional, but from their side, totally 100% positive intentions in building this relationship, because that's the key to work together. And I think these are the things that these cultural differences or the work that we do, it highlights. So you can understand the thought process, the mind of the other side, so that you don't always see what you call the spectacles, your own spectacles. There are many different spectacles depending on which country you're in, and they don't always see the same situation the same way. Yeah, and I think attrition is a very interesting topic. Also, I think these days...
Just say one thing on attrition before we move on.
Yeah.
And this is why I say that this topic is a need to know, not a nice to know. It's a need to do, not a nice to do. And you say, well, okay, attrition's, a bit higher than it would be, or quite a bit higher than it would be in the USA. But think of what the commercial implications of that are for you. So one of the reasons that not the only reason, but one of the reasons you probably decided to move some of your operations to India is to realize a cost arbitrage. But if you find you've got 35% attrition, that cost arbitrage disappears very quickly through increased costs of recruitment and retraining and the mistakes that happen in the early stages of anybody being onboarded. And so for me, this is a topic you can't afford not to address. If you are interested in making sure your operations work as effectively as possible, both at an operational level and at a cost level, you have to address these things. Otherwise, you're just going to bleed. You're going to bleed over long periods of time. And you, as senior leaders, if there's any senior leaders watching here, you're going to be asked by your senior leaders, where's this benefit that was supposed to be realized from this? We're not seeing it. All we're seeing is problems. Now, I have worked, as I've said, on well over 60, 70 of these projects, and I've seen them go incredibly well, where great benefit has accrued to all parties, both the home teams in the States and Europe, and also the Indian side of this. Seen it go really, really well. But on the other hand, I've seen it go really, really, really badly, to the extent where the work has been repatriated to the West at enormous cost to the business. And one of the things that exercises me, and I've thought about a lot over the years, is, so what's the difference? You know, why does one project go well and why does another one go badly? And the one consistent thing that I can see which makes the difference between the two is the attitude and the preparedness of the home teams. The home teams have got to get this right from the beginning. You've got to have a really effective transition and knowledge transfer plan, which takes into account all of these cultural issues. The cultural issue should be at the heart of the whole plan. And if you get that right, it's going to have tremendously positive impacts. If you get that wrong, it's going to create ripples that will go on for a very, very long time. And you have to plan it well in advance. I mean, quite often, as you know, Nev, when these transition processes happen, they also result in some downsizing back at the home base. And in fact, even sometimes the people who are asked to transition the work and do the knowledge transfer are people who themselves will be losing their jobs as a result of this process. That's a very, very difficult thing to handle and manage. And knowledge and the right attitude from the outset are absolutely critical in that. Put some thought into this, do it professionally, get the right help, the right external consultants in. You don't have to do this yourself, and it will bear fruit, I guarantee.
Great. We have a question, which I think is exactly where we are, what we're discussing right now. It's from Vidya, which is around, what's your opinion, should the Western leadership do with regard to messaging to the home team? So when they are planning that we're going to be setting up new teams in India, or if there's any offshoring involved, because like you said, usually there is a resentment. Usually there is a negative feeling with most of the teams around, the jobs, or there's a new team setting up in India. How can the local manager, the leadership in the Western world, how can they manage the expectation? How can they manage this process, especially when it comes to sharing the message with the local team?
Well, I think the key message has got to be, hasn't it, that this is not a bunch of distant people in a faraway land, but these people are members of your team in the same way that Charlie and Susan, who are sitting in the same office as you in Ohio, they're part of your team, but so's Vidya and so's Rohit in India. We're all part of the same team. And you very quickly in an organization get to realize that that is not the case. Because when you're talking to people in the States or in the UK, it's, we do this, they do that. So there's obviously in the mindset a bifurcation, there's a separation. There's the team over there, there's the team over here. And there has to be a coordinated and collaborative team approach. And that has to start with the home team. The home team have to make that message very clear. And this is, when people come to us and say, we've got a communication problem, they have, but that's not what they're talking about. But that is probably their biggest communication problem that they have, about the language, the separation type language that they use. And also, I think that there's quite often a lot of fear associated when an offshore into India project is announced. There's a lot of fear in the home team, which is related to potential loss of jobs in the home team. So I think the senior leadership back at base have to be very honest about that. Either, yes, that there will result in layoffs, but we're going to treat you very well. This is the plan for you. Or, in fact, no, there aren't going to. This is growth. This is growth. This is going to be good for us because we're growing as a company. And this is going to be good for you. So the messaging has to be really positive at the beginning. What you can't do, one of the problems I've come across sometimes is in the West, the way that this is messaged is, yeah, we are moving some work to India, guys, but don't worry about it, because what we're going to do is we're going to send all the really boring, simple stuff that you hate doing to India. So we'll just leave all the interesting stuff for you. And so, first of all, what that does, it puts in the mindset of the people in the home team that the people in India are just there to do almost like schoolboy type work. So they have a patronizing approach to them. But the other thing that means is that all that boring work that you send to India, guess what? Those people in India who are highly qualified, highly educated, maybe have 2 degrees, they find that really boring work really boring. And what do? They leave. And so, you've got the messaging around this has got to be really carefully done. But in my experience, people just don't think it through. They just don't think it through. I think I've told you this story now. A few years ago, I was asked to go out to I think it was Chicago to run a training session with the senior leadership team of quite a large global organization who were working on a quick transition to India. I think it's like 1,500 jobs. This was March, had to be done by the end of November. It's a really quick thing. And and the senior leadership team asked me to go over and spend half a day with them to talk about what challenges they might encounter when they were doing this transition. I went and spent half a day with them. They gave me a nice lunch at the end of it, said, thank you very much, Keith, sent me on my way. And I didn't hear anything from them at all for about a year. And then a year later, they asked me to come back and do 2 days with them. And I got into the room and I said to the CEO, so how's it gone? And the CEO said, well, everything you told us would happen, Keith, has actually happened. But when you told us, we didn't believe you. We thought we could manage through it. And everybody thinks they can just manage through it. But how do you manage through it when you don't have the experience, you don't have the knowledge, and you don't have the right mindset? And that's what you have to organize right from the get-go, before the get-go. It has to be built into all the planning, and very rarely is.
Great. I'm looking at the time. We are already 4 minutes over our scheduled time. I'm sure all our listeners are very busy, so we will not take more of your time. Like we said, this is first of our hopefully many such discussion topics. If you want us to cover any specific countries, any specific topics, do get in touch with us. We can always look into that. And like we said, we will be aiming to do at least one LinkedIn live session every month. And we will have something very exciting for you for the next month. So keep an eye on our LinkedIn page in GBC. And if there's obviously anywhere you need our help and support with any of your project or any work, or just want to have a chat with us, you can get in touch with all of us, Keith, myself, and the rest of the team.
Yeah, and what I would also say is that is there any specific issues that we touched on today, like team building or attrition or whatever, that you'd like us to dive into in much more detail? Then maybe we could schedule another LinkedIn live looking at one topic in a bit more granular fashion. But from me and from Nav, thanks everybody. I hope you found this useful. I've enjoyed doing it.
Thank you very much, and have a good day, everyone. Bye for now.
Bye from me too.